was in my late 20s at the time this story was shared with me by my grandfather, who was pushing late 80s. I'm in my 40s now, and though I'm not much of a writer, I've always found that this story needed to be written down somewhere, that it needed to be heard. While it's not your traditional ghost story, it is a bit of a horror story. So my grandfather, Alan, as I said, he was old. He was still feisty as ever, but he had recently started mentioning how he was ready for the Lord to take him. So I think with this mortal awareness, he's been a lot more willing to share stories about his life. I won't pretend we've ever had some loving, special relationship. Aside from a few family gatherings that he'd make an appearance at, there wasn't much engagement between the two of us. Or he and my parents even. After my grandma Tony died, he'd married someone new, Laura. She was really the glue keeping him together at all. When she passed, his already pessimistic disposition became a religion. For the last 4 years up to this point, he'd lived in a nursing home uptown. My dad had made sure that every accommodation that he could ever need was met. One of those 5-star chandelier in the front room nursing homes. Even with the 24-hour assistance there, he still called my dad or I every couple of days to help move something or take him somewhere. I think he was lonely, and although he'd never admit it, I think he enjoyed the time with us. So I was happy to pick him up and drive him to the bank or the grocery store when he called me. Our last interaction together, however, for the first time, gave me real perspective on why we should respect our elders. I mean, they've lived twice as long as we have. All the bullshit that we've experienced growing up, they've done it double. Chances are, if you're young, you haven't had the true, very worst experience of your life. Not yet. But on the contrary, your best day is still to come as well. If you're old, you've seen it, you've done it. You're wiser and mentally stronger than you were from the life that you've lived. And some old people, let me tell you, have lived through some wild shit. My family is just one example of likely many. Anyway, the story. When I picked up my grandfather for breakfast that morning, he looked exhausted. When we got to a table, I finally asked him why he looked so tired. He told me that he hadn't gotten any sleep the past couple of nights because he'd been having night terrors again. The same reoccurring dreams since Tuesday. I asked what were the dreams about, and he says, Jesus, I ought to share this with someone before I die. And then he goes, not even your grandma and your parents know the details of this one. Do you want to know how your grandpa Sam died? And so, over a grand slamwich at Denny's, I learned the real story behind my Grandpa Sam's untimely death. Grandpa Sam was my mom's dad. He died before I was born. What I was told growing up is that he died in a boating accident. Apparently, no, that's not how he died. There was a boat crash, but that's not what killed him. And my other grandfather, Alan, was there when it happened. A brief catch-up on some family tree dynamics may help this read better, or at the very least write better. So, back in the day, before my parents were born, Alan and Sam were already friends. They'd gone to high school together. And eventually they'd meet their future wives, also high school friends, Lorraine and Tony, at community college. Eventually, Grandpa Sam joins the military, visits Bora Bora while overseas, comes home with the idea of proposing to my future grandma Lorraine and getting married there. Meanwhile, Grandpa Alan and Grandma Tony get hitched. 2 years pass. Grandpa Sam's plan actually comes together. They fly to Tahiti, then take another smaller plane to Bora Bora. The couples stay in bungalows for 2 days until the wedding. Sam and Lorraine don't drink because days before they leave, Lorraine finds out she's pregnant with my mom. But Alan and future Grandma Tony live it up. Morning of day 2, Sam asks Alan if he wants to go fishing. They can rent a little speedboat in town. Alan's hungover but feels bad that Sam hasn't been able to let loose on this trip, so he obliged the request. The speedboat that they rent is a small wooden vessel with an old motor on the back, built into the back of the boat with a real homemade welding job, creating the illusion of stability. Sam fires it up and they leave the dock as Alan tries to read a paper map of the islands provided by the boat shop. Sam starts really pushing the engine on this motor and they're flying through the water. He's yipping and laughing, but Alan, still being violently hungover, begs Sam to slow down. Sitting on the front bench with his head tucked in between his knees, Alan continues to feel the boat skip the clear tropical waters. Miles go by before Alan lifts his head and starts to scream at Sam to cut the engine. Sam finally releases the throttle and the boat jostles to a stop. He then apparently had a breakdown, crying to Alan that he's not ready to be a dad yet. The following hour, him and Alan have a real heart-to-heart, and he talks Sam down from his emotional peak. Within this hour span of bonding, they're unaware how much further out their boat has been pushed by the current. The designated markers indicated by the map are no longer in sight. The gas remaining in the tank slowly dwindles away, and they're forced to use the oars located under the wooden benches that Alan was dry heaving on hours ago. As the waves around them grow, one of the swells brings them to a height where Sam sees a landmass. Another hour passes on Alan's wristwatch as they battle the choppy waves in the direction Sam said to go, and the landmass is now clearly ahead in the distance. A beacon of hope just on the horizon line. They were both aware that it could take them until nightfall to actually reach the shore. Close to 100 yards away, they're navigating the jagged reef below as the water goes up and down, revealing their sharp points when they rise and detract back into invisibility. The combination of a tall wave and its force against the bottom of the boat launches Alan and Sam straight up. Alan breaks his nose on the metal motor while Sam lands upside down, halfway in the boat, under the bench and tackle box, while the rest of his body folds in the opposite direction, landing outside of the boat, paralyzing him. My grandpa says that Grandpa Sam immediately started shouting that he couldn't feel his legs. He had to leave Sam lodged under the bench and try to navigate this wooden boat to shore by himself. Alan manages to keep the boat stabilized and paddles the remaining distance. Drifting towards the shoreline, Alan starts to hear gurgling. Reef damage had sprung leaks in the boat, and Sam is struggling to keep his head from submersion. Alan's at a point where he can jump out of the boat and reach the ground to pull it into the sand. Alan then grabs Sam out of the boat and pulls him further onto land before collapsing from exhaustion. It was night by the time they arrived, but the humid tropical weather kept the air warm and comfortable. Finding shelter and building a fire wasn't a necessity for survival through the night, so they both just laid in the sand. Sam winced through the pain in quiet tears until he passed out, The only thing Alan could do was reassure him that someone will come looking for them. Both of them were significantly bloodied from open wounds and gashes from meeting with the reef. Unable to catch his own sleep, my Grandpa Alan decides to get up and explore a little bit of this island. For all he knew, civilization could be right past the tree line. The moon is bright enough to provide adequate light, enough to get a small bearing of the terrain that they're calling home for the night. When he approaches the tree line, he discovers the rules for the moon do not apply in there. The tree canopy is too thick for its light to penetrate. There's no sign of civilization, no artifactual light in the distance, no indication that this island is even inhabited. Alan decides not to travel further into the forest. Instead, gather palm tree branches and begin to make a giant SOS on the beach. Alan continues to make trips further and further down the tree line, collecting branches and bringing them back. But he says it's on his fourth trip down. He hears Sam let out a breathless holler. Alan drops what he's carrying and pushes his tired legs to run back to where Sam is laying. Approaching through the dark, Alan says it looks like silhouettes of a few big stones had been placed on Sam. But in the seconds it took him to get closer, he saw that the stones were moving, and more of these things were crawling from the forest line onto the beach. When Alan got close enough to see what he'd been staring at, the sight broke something inside of him. No longer silhouettes, now vivid purple and red shells. Some coconut crabs had wandered out of the forest for an easy meal, and more were coming to join in. By the time Alan reached Sam, coconut crabs had covered his entire body. Alan ran to the boat and retrieved an oar, and he started swinging at the increasing number of coconut crabs, but was eventually outnumbered to the point of needing to flee himself to avoid sharing the same fate. My Grandpa Alan had to watch from afar as the coconut crabs eventually dragged separated body parts of Sam into the forest. By the time the sun had risen, Sam's body was entirely gone. In agony, Alan finished the SOS sign and was spotted by an aircraft later that evening. When he got back to the bungalows, he had to break the news to everyone. It was earth-shattering. He never wanted to go into detail, and he'd never told anyone about seeing Grandpa Sam's body. But every decade or so, he's plagued with night terrors about being back on that beach. We both cried at Denny's that day. I cried when I dropped him off, too. I'm really grateful that he told me about this repressed memory. I always hoped that it helped him release the reoccurring nightmares that he was having. I personally don't think that my jaw has closed since that Denny's trip. Talk to your grandparents. Ask them about when they were young. You might be as surprised at what they say as I was. When my wife and I were still in the dating phase of our relationship, my soon-to-be mother-in-law, Arlita, called me up one evening, asking if I could check out a noise she'd been hearing in her attic. She thought a critter possibly found its way up there. It wouldn't be the first time I've had to remove an unwanted guest who started living in the walls of this poor woman's house. This actually happened enough that I had made my own possum-catching gear for when I'd need to wrangle another hot one. The critter kit consisted of rubber kitchen gloves, a flashlight, my fly fishing net, and an old raccoon trap. I tossed it all in the back of my truck and headed over there after work. It was evening by the time I arrived. Upon entering, I was greeted with a hug and then was detailed about the usual bumps and thumps that she was hearing. In addition to these noises, though, she told me it sounds like someone's humming in the attic. This should have been my first indication that I wasn't going to be finding a possum when I climbed up there. Access to her attic is from a ceiling pull string that releases a rickety old folding ladder. When that thing drops, I have to be swift getting in there and closing it back up as to not risk the mystery animal gaining entry to the main house. I put my rubber gloves on, and I held the fish net with one hand and the raccoon trap with my flashlight inside tightly with the other. Arlita pulled the string and I dashed up the fragile wooden stairs. When I reach the top, she pushes the ladder hatch back up behind me, momentarily leaving me in the dark while I fumble for that flashlight. Quickly and quietly, I pull it out of the raccoon trap, and I hit the switch. The beam casts a bright circle at the nearest wall to me. I start to examine every nook and cranny from floor to ceiling of each wall. Stepping slowly and lightly still results in the floorboards creaking under my feet, like I was stepping on cattails. I've only partially inspected the first wall when I begin to hear the humming that she'd previously mentioned. The sound is coming from behind me, so I spin around and throw the beam towards the opposite wall. As I do, it illuminates a figure near the corner. The imposing height it's standing at scares me backwards, tripping over the raccoon trap and onto the dusty floor. In the fall, I drop my flashlight, and it rolls up against the wall, concealing its light to a focused eclipse 3 yards past my first swipe to reclaim it. Accompanying my fall is the dramatic increase of the hum. Lost in the pitch black, I was horrified as the growing sound finally registered in my brain. This was undoubtedly worse than a possum, worse than an intruder, even worse than bees. The rumble from my fall had aggravated a wasp's nest, the size of a small child, reaching from floor to ceiling in the furthest corner of the attic. The shake had jostled it enough to bend in a way that opened a crack that they'd now been flooding out of. The single-handed, most painful and terrifying event of my life then commences. I'm still in complete darkness when the wasps start to attack. A cloud of razor blades brings me to my knees, engulfing my body like a dense fog of buzzing and stingers. They're getting into my clothes and under my rubber gloves. I will receive hundreds of stings before Arlita hears me screaming and pounding on the attic floor. When the hatch is released, the wasps immediately escape the attic and swarm Arlita. She's now screaming and running through the house and out the door. I drag myself to the illuminated square, and I let myself fall down the ladder steps before getting to my feet and running, all the while continuously being stung. My pace eventually catches up to Arlita, and we're now 3 blocks away, out of breath, covered in welts and swelling stings, still wincing and pulling the remaining wasps out of her hair and clothing. Not knowing what else to do, and neither one of us having a phone, we limped to the closest house from where we had landed. I sat on the street as Arlita knocked and was greeted by a look of shock. The homeowner brought the phone out to her, sliding it between a slit in the screen door, letting her use it on the porch. Arlita called her daughter, and she left work to come pick us up. We then went to the hospital. After the hospital, the 2 of them stayed the night at my family's house until we could figure it out in the morning. In retrospect, this trauma, I'm sure, inevitably made all of our relationships stronger. May very well have been some subconscious bonding block for us. When your mother-in-law loves you, you know you're going to be golden with your partner. Either way, I'll never ever forget that memory and the people I shared it with.